A mother devastated by the loss of her son takes a job at an isolated house to care for a baby. But when she sees him, she discovers that he has the same smile as her dead son. Is it a coincidence or something much darker? The road wound through the mountains, shrouded in ever denser fog. Elaine gripped the steering wheel tightly as the silence of the landscape dragged her into dark thoughts. It had been a year since her world had fallen apart. The image of Daniel, her son, haunted her every step. His laughter, his little feet running around the house, and the inexplicable emptiness that his absence had left. Grief had been a devouring monster, and accepting that job as a nanny seemed the only way to escape. A change of scenery, her friend Laura had told her. It will do you good. Elaine wasn't sure. In fact, she felt like a stranger in her own body ever since she came to this remote region. But she needed the money, and she needed to get away. The house finally appeared between the trees, an ancient structure with pointed roofs and tall windows that looked like watchful eyes. He got out of the car and took a deep breath. The air was cold and heavy. "Welcome, Elaine," said Arthur, a middle-aged man waiting on the porch. His voice was deep, almost forced to be friendly. Elaine climbed the steps and shook his hand. Arthur led her inside, where the interior of the house was even more somber than the outside. High ceilings, dark wooden furniture, and an almost unreal silence. Clara, Arthur's wife, was in the living room. She had a fragile figure and an expressionless gaze that fixed on Elaine for only a second. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Clara said in a dry tone. "Our son Lucas needs constant care." "Of course," Elaine replied, trying to sound professional, but something in Clara's eyes made her shiver. Arthur showed him the room he would occupy. It was small but cozy compared to the rest of the house. The window looked out onto a forest that seemed endless. It won't be so bad, he thought. But then he heard a cry, a child's cry, soft, like a distant echo. "It's Lucas," Arthur said with a quick smile. "Clara has him in her room. You'll start with him tomorrow." Elaine nodded, though the feeling of unease did not leave her. That sound had stirred something deep inside her, a wound she thought had been sealed. That night, Elaine sat up in bed and stared at the ceiling. The house creaked in the wind, and the darkness seemed alive. The image of Daniel, so clear in her mind, returned mercilessly. Her heart clenched as tears ran down her cheeks. This place is a mistake, she thought, but at the same time, a voice inside her whispered something else. "Stay. There's something here for you." Translated from Spanish to English, www.onlinedoctranslator.com. And for the first time in a long time, Elaine allowed herself to listen. The cold was seeping through the cracks in the windows when Elaine woke up in the middle of the night. The house was so silent that the faint sound of the wind outside seemed like a distant cry. For a moment, she thought it had all been a dream, but then she heard that cry again. Lucas. He put a jacket over his pajamas and left the room. The hallways were long and dark, barely lit by the moonlight coming through the windows. Every step he took seemed to echo off the wooden walls. The baby's crying became louder as he approached Lucas's bedroom door. He pushed the door open slowly and saw Clara sitting in a rocking chair next to the crib, cradling Lucas in her arms. The dim light prevented him from seeing Clara's face properly, but the baby was visible, a small, calm face with closed eyes. "Is everything okay?" Elaine asked quietly. Clara raised her head slowly, as if in a trance, and gave him a brief look. "He woke up scared. He's calmed down now," she replied coldly. Her voice held no trace of tenderness. Elaine looked at Lucas and felt a chill run down her spine. It was strange. There was something about his peaceful expression, the way his lips curved slightly, that was all too familiar. Suddenly, her mind was invaded by the image of Daniel. Her son usually slept the same way, with his head tilted slightly to one side and a small hand on the blanket. "It's just your imagination," she thought as she tried to push the thought away. Still, the weight on her chest wouldn't go away. "Go back to rest, Elaine," Clara said in a firmer tone, as if she were reading her thoughts. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Elaine nodded, murmuring a good night, and closed the door behind her. She returned to her room, her heart beating rapidly. Despite the cold, beads of sweat were beading on her forehead. "And you?" he added, changing the subject. Why did you decide to accept this job so far away from everything? Elaine shrugged slightly. Sometimes getting away helps you heal. Arthur didn't answer. He just nodded slightly before leaving the kitchen. Elaine was left alone, with an empty cup and a growing certainty that something in this house didn't fit. The sound of Elaine's cell phone woke her at dawn. The dim light came through the window, painting the room in a grayish tone. Looking at the screen, she saw a message from her friend Laura. "How are you? Call me when you can. Take care." The simple phrase reminded her that the world outside those mountains still existed, but she already felt trapped in something she could barely explain. After a deep sigh, Elaine stood up and headed for Lucas's room. This time she didn't need to ask. Arthur and Clara were nowhere to be seen, and the house was deathly silent. Opening the door, she found the baby awake, looking up at her from his crib with those big dark eyes that seemed to study her. "Hey, little one," Elaine whispered as she approached. Her heart was pounding. For a second, she felt the urge to back away, but instead she reached out and scooped him up. Lucas settled into her chest with an ease that unnerved her. That was when she noticed it. The baby's scent, warm and familiar, identical to Daniel's. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, it was as if time stood still. But the moment was broken when Lucas began fiddling with something in his tiny fist. Elaine pulled back the blanket and saw what he had. A small red toy car. Her breath caught. "No, it can't be," she whispered. The stroller was identical to the one Daniel usually carried with him everywhere. There was no way it could be the same one, and yet there it was, in the hands of the baby she barely knew. Elaine stared at him, searching for something in his expression that would tell her he was losing his mind. But Lucas just looked at her curiously, as if the weight of the moment didn't exist for him. Determined not to give in to paranoia, she placed the boy in his high chair and began preparing his breakfast. All the while, her mind was racing. How could he be so similar? And that toy? It's not possible. Throughout the morning, Elaine tried to distract herself with household chores. But as the hours passed, Lucas kept showing her little glimpses that chilled her blood. The way he turned his head at the sound of her name, just like Daniel did. The way he laughed when she made sounds with her lips, identical to her son's. Even Lucas's babbling had a timbre that haunted her. She couldn't help herself. When Clara went out for a walk and Arthur disappeared into the office, Elaine seized the moment. She quickly ran up the stairs and began exploring the rooms on the second floor. Every closed door made her feel like the house was hiding something she needed to discover. Reaching the end of the hallway, he found a room with a doorknob covered in dust, as if no one had touched it in years. He tried to turn it, but it was locked. He leaned forward, trying to hear any sound on the other side, but found only silence. "What are they hiding here?" she murmured, feeling the anxiety growing inside her. A noise behind her made her jump. She turned quickly and saw Arthur standing there, watching her with a tight smile. "Are you looking for something, Elaine?" "No, I just wanted to see more of the house," she replied, trying to sound carefree. Arthur looked at her in silence for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity before answering. "There are places that are better left unseen. This house is old and holds many stories. Some should stay that way." Her tone was friendly, but the warning was clear. Elaine nodded, murmuring an apology, and headed down the stairs, her heart racing. As she held Lucas that afternoon, she couldn't help but wonder, what story does this house hold? And why do I feel like it belongs to me? Night fell like a heavy blanket over the house. Elaine sat up in bed with the lamp on, staring at the notebook she had begun using as a diary since her arrival. She hadn't written much, just scattered thoughts. "Lucas reminds me of Daniel. It's absurd, but I can't help it. This house is hiding something, and Clara and Arthur know more than they're saying." The wind softly hit the windows, and although silence still reigned, every corner of the house seemed to breathe on its own. Elaine got up and opened the door to her room. She couldn't sleep. She needed answers, or at least a distraction. She walked through the halls barefoot, feeling the cold wood under her feet. Suddenly, she saw a dim light filtering in from beneath Arthur's office door. She approached slowly and heard low murmurs. Arthur's voice was unmistakable, but she couldn't make out any words. Then silence. The light went out. Elaine quickly backed away and returned to the room. To his room, his heart pounding. Who was Arthur talking to? He asked himself, but found no answers. In the morning, Elaine decided to confront the situation from another angle. Clara was in the kitchen making tea when Elaine walked in with Lucas in her arms. "This house is funny," Elaine said, trying to sound casual as she placed the baby in his high chair. "There's something special about it, like it holds a lot of stories." Clara did not look up from her cup. "It's just an old house, Elaine, nothing more." "And the room at the end of the hall?" "It's locked," Elaine commented, watching Clara's reaction closely. For the first time, the woman stopped her movements. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed the spoon on the table. "It's a storage room," he finally replied coldly. "Old stuff we don't need. There's no reason for you to worry about it." Elaine knew he was lying, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she decided to wait until the house was empty again. Hours later, when Clara went out into the garden and Arthur went up to his office, Elaine took the opportunity. Lucas was sleeping peacefully in his crib, and the house was plunged into a silence that, far from reassuring her, seemed to observe her. She went up the stairs and stood in front of the locked door. This time, she had a hairpin with her that she took out of her pocket. She was not an expert, but her determination drove her. After several clumsy attempts, the mechanism gave way. Elaine held her breath as she pushed open the door and stepped inside. What she found left her frozen. It was a child's room. Daylight barely filtered through the dusty curtains, but he could see clearly. A crib, toys scattered on the floor, and a small wardrobe. Everything was covered with a thin layer of dust, as if no one had entered it for years. The most disconcerting thing was that the room did not look like a simple storage room. Elaine walked over to the crib, feeling the weight of something inexplicable pressing down on her chest. On the mattress, crumpled and forgotten, she found a small blue wool hat, just like the one Daniel had worn when he was a baby. She took it in her shaking hands, struggling not to break it. "It can't be," she whispered, feeling the tears burning in her eyes. Suddenly, she heard footsteps. "Arthur." Elaine dropped the hat back into the crib and ran out, slamming the door behind her. She barely made it to her room when the footsteps stopped in the hallway. Beneath the door, she saw the shadow of motionless feet. The silence stretched on until the shadow disappeared. Elaine sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She knew she had been right. This house held secrets, secrets that were somehow connected to her son. The image of the blue hat kept haunting her. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Elaine woke up that morning with the image of the nursery still etched in her mind. The blue hat, the crib, the toys. Everything was too familiar, as if time had created a cruel mockery of her own life. As she dressed Lucas, she noticed his gaze fixed on her, as if the baby could read her thoughts. "Who are you really, little one?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. Lucas responded with an innocent giggle, but Elaine didn't find that funny at all. Determined to find answers, Elaine began to explore the house more carefully. She hoped to find something, any clue that would clarify why this boy and the objects in this house evoked Daniel so much. While she was clearing the shelves in the living room, she found a small wooden box hidden behind several dusty books. She carefully opened it and saw what she least expected: old photographs. In the first picture, Clara appeared much younger, holding a baby in her arms. Elaine's heart skipped a beat. The baby looked exactly like Lucas, but what really shook her was the object in his little hand, the same red stroller that Daniel always carried around with him. She flipped to the next photo, and this time she saw Arthur standing in what looked like a hospital, holding a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. The same blanket that Daniel had on the day he was born. "My God," she whispered, covering her mouth with her hand. "What are you doing?" Clara's voice rang out from the entrance to the living room, cold and sharp. Elaine turned sharply, feeling trapped with the photos still in her hand. Clara advanced on her with firm steps and snatched the box from her. "You have no right to touch our things," Clara snapped, her gaze so hard it seemed capable of piercing through her. Elaine tried to justify herself. "Sorry, I was cleaning and I found this by accident." "Who is the baby in the photos, Clara?" Clara closed the box with a thud and held it to her chest. "It's none of your business. Remember that you're here to take care of Lucas. Nothing more." His voice was more of a threatening whisper than an explanation. Then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Elaine alone and trembling. Elaine looked at him, trying to decide if she could trust him. There was something in the way Arthur looked at her, less stern than Clara, but just as evasive. "Arthur, I need to know," she said finally. "Lucas. Who is he really? Why are there things here that remind me so much of my son?" Arthur seemed to freeze for a moment. His jaw tightened before he forced a weak smile. "I don't know what you're talking about, Elaine. Lucas is our adopted son, that's all. I know his presence might stir up old memories in you, but maybe you need time to get used to it." "Why did you adopt Lucas?" Elaine insisted, her voice shaking. Arthur was silent for a few seconds before answering. "We found him. He was handed over to us. Abandoned, near a hospital. It was a few months ago." His gaze shifted slightly as if he were afraid to confront her. "And the mother? Does anyone know who she is?" Arthur shook his head slowly. "No. We just know that he needed a home. Clara saw it as a sign, and we decided to accept him." Elaine felt that Arthur was lying. His words were careful, too calculated, as if he was trying to hide something behind each sentence. But without proof, she couldn't accuse him of anything. That night while Lucas slept, Elaine lay awake, staring at the little red stroller she had sneaked out of the nursery. She held it in her hands, trying to comprehend the impossible. It was becoming harder and harder to deny what her heart was screaming at her. Lucas wasn't just a coincidence. There was a real connection to Daniel. "I'm going to find out the truth," he whispered softly, with a new firmness in his gaze. From somewhere in the house, a distant creaking sound echoed in the darkness, as if the house itself was listening to it. Elaine woke up at dawn with a feeling of tightness in her chest. The night had been restless, full of blurred dreams where Daniel's face mixed with Lucas's laughter and the shadows of Clara and Arthur. She felt trapped between reality and a growing delirium. The house, with its constant silence, seemed to be watching her, as if it were aware of her most intimate thoughts. When I went down to the kitchen, Arthur was there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee in his hands. He looked tired, the dark circles under his eyes betraying an equally long night. The dim light coming through the window cast long shadows on his face. "Did you sleep well?" Arthur asked, trying to sound cordial. Elaine looked at him, still with last night's resolution in mind. She knew she couldn't keep avoiding the questions that plagued her. "No, Arthur, I didn't sleep well," he answered directly. "I need answers. I can't take it anymore." Arthur put the cup down on the table and looked at her seriously, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Please sit down," he said in a softer tone than usual. Elaine obeyed, her heart pounding as Arthur took a breath, like someone deciding to cross a dangerous line. "Lucas, he's not our biological son," Arthur began, his voice calm but heavy. "We found him under unusual circumstances. He was wrapped in a blanket, alone, near a small, abandoned rural hospital. It was a few months ago. There were no records, no notes, nothing. Just a baby." Elaine felt a lump form in her throat. "And the police? Nobody investigated?" Arthur shook his head. "We informed the authorities, but there was not much they could do. The story was left hanging in the air. And in the end, Clara felt it was a sign. We couldn't have children, and Lucas arrived just when we needed him most. We decided to adopt him." Elaine stared at him in disbelief. There was something in his voice, in his expression, that betrayed a half-truth. "That's not all, is it?" she insisted, feeling her control begin to crack. "There's something else you're not telling me." Arthur looked away and stood up from his chair, walking towards the window. His figure seemed heavier than usual. "I don't understand why you're so obsessed, Elaine," she finally said, her tone almost pleading. "Lucas is safe here. He's a happy boy, and that's all you should care about." Elaine clenched her fists in her lap, trying to control the whirlwind of emotions that was overwhelming her. "You can't ask me to ignore this. Everything about Lucas reminds me of Daniel. His laugh, the way he looks at me, even that damn red car." "How do you explain that?" Arthur turned slowly, his face now hardened. "I don't know, Elaine. I don't know what you're looking for, but I'm warning you. There are some things that are better left undisturbed. The threat in his voice chilled her blood. Arthur walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone, the echo of his words ringing in her head. Elaine looked over at the makeshift crib in the living room, where Lucas was sleeping peacefully. She walked over and ran a shaky hand through his soft hair. "I'm going to find out the truth, little one," she whispered. "No matter what happens." It was a medical report dated 9 months ago. In the upper margin, the name of the rural hospital where Lucas had supposedly been found was clearly visible. But what really took her breath away was the description of the baby. Male, approximately 6 weeks old. No identification. Blue blanket with embroidery and red toy in hand. Elaine dropped the folder on the desk. The blue blanket. The red cart. "My God," he gasped. There was no longer any doubt. Lucas and Daniel were connected in a way that defied all logic. And Arthur, Clara, they knew it. When she heard the car engine approaching, Elaine hurriedly closed everything and went downstairs, her heart pounding in her throat. She couldn't let them know what she had discovered. Not yet. As Arthur walked in with the bags and Clara watched from the doorway, Elaine forced a smile. "Everything okay?" Clara asked in her usual distant tone. "Yes," Elaine replied, her voice firmer than she expected. "Everything is perfect." But inside, his mind was already planning the next step. He was closer to the truth, and he wouldn't stop until he found out everything. The chill of the night permeated every corner of the house. Elaine sat on her bed with a small lamp on, staring at the file she had stolen from Arthur's office. The yellowed edges and typed words on the medical report seemed to come to life in her mind. Over and over again. "Boy, 6 weeks old, red toy. Blue blanket." The connection was too clear, too terrifying. Luke, it couldn't be a coincidence. And if she was, then the universe had dealt her a cruel blow. She could barely sleep that night. She woke up several times to noises. Creaking old wood, squeaking doors, distant footsteps in the hallways. Or maybe it was just her mind, exhausted and paranoid, playing tricks on her. When morning came, Elaine decided she couldn't live with doubts any longer. She knew the house held more secrets, and she was determined to uncover them. Over breakfast, she watched Arthur and Clara more closely. Clara barely glanced at her. Instead, her attention was fixed on Lucas, who was playing with a spoon. Arthur looked nervous, as if he too was carrying an unbearable truth. "I'm going for a walk with Lucas," Elaine announced suddenly, trying to sound casual. Arthur and Clara looked at each other briefly, as if assessing the situation. "Don't go too far," Arthur replied in his friendly yet distant tone. "The forest isn't safe." Elaine nodded and readied Lucas. As she carried him into the garden, the cool, fresh breeze hit her face, clearing her thoughts. Despite the situation, Lucas smiled innocently, resting his small head on Elaine's shoulder. That gesture, so simple, was like a knife in his chest. It was Daniel. Everything about him was. She decided to go a little further away from the house, not for a walk, but to think. She walked along the path that led to the woods, trying to piece together the puzzle. Then she saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. At the bottom of a hill, barely visible through the tall grass, was an ancient structure, a weathered wooden trunk, like the ones that used to be used to store valuable belongings. Elaine approached with Lucas in her arms, feeling her heart hammer in her chest. "What is this?" he whispered. She carefully placed Lucas on a blanket and leaned over to open the trunk. The lid gave way with a harsh creak. What she found inside took her breath away. A crumpled letter, several old toys, and a blue blanket with embroidery. Elaine trembled as she held the blanket in her hands. It was Daniel's same blanket, the one he had with him the last time she saw him. Through her tears and confusion, she took the letter and began to read with trembling hands. "To whoever finds this child was given to us under strange circumstances. We were told that he had been taken from his mother for reasons we still do not know. We cannot carry this guilt any longer. Please take care of him. He deserves to live. He is a special child." The letter was unsigned and undated, but the words were clear enough. Elaine felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. "It can't be," she sobbed, clutching the letter to her chest. Lucas began to cry softly, as if he felt Elaine's pain. She lifted him up in her arms, tears rolling down her cheeks. The weight of the truth was too much. Lucas wasn't just an adopted child. He had been given away, stolen, snatched from his life, and brought to Clara and Arthur. He returned to the house with the trunk still open in his mind and the weight of the letter in his pocket. That night, Elaine barely spoke. Clara watched her suspiciously while Arthur avoided meeting her gaze. When she went up to her room, she sat on the bed with Lucas in her arms and stared at him. "You're Daniel, I know it. In some ways, you are." Lucas smiled, oblivious to everything that was happening around him. But for Elaine, that smile was a silent confirmation. The truth had peeked through the cracks in that house, but there were still pieces missing from the mystery. And Elaine, more determined than ever, knew that the final confrontation was approaching. The air in the house had become thick, unbreathable. Elaine could no longer pretend normality. With the letter in her pocket and the image of the blue blanket engraved in her mind, she knew that the moment of truth had arrived. She could no longer remain a spectator in the macabre game that Clara and Arthur seemed to be playing. That night, she waited for the house to fall silent. Lucas slept in his crib, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions brewing inside Elaine. Clutching the piece of paper, she made her way down the stairs to the living room, where the dim light of a lamp betrayed Arthur's presence. Arthur was sitting in an armchair, a drink in his hand. He looked tired, as if he too was carrying a heavy truth. When he saw her enter, he looked up with an expression that tried to be friendly, but his eyes betrayed fear. "We need to talk," Elaine said firmly, standing in front of him. "Talk about what?" Arthur replied, although he seemed to know the answer. "About Lucas, about Daniel, about everything you've been hiding from me?" Arthur sighed deeply and put his glass down. The calmness of his gesture only infuriated Elaine further. "I know everything, Arthur. I found the letter. I know that Lucas was delivered to you, and I know it has something to do with my son. Tell me the truth at once." Arthur remained silent, staring at the ground. His hands trembled slightly until he finally spoke. "We didn't plan it," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Clara was never able to have children. When Lucas was offered to her, she thought it was a miracle, a second chance. Did they offer you?" "Who?" Elaine insisted, taking a step closer. Arthur looked up slowly, as if the weight of her words could destroy him. "A man. I don't know who he was. He showed up at the rural hospital one day. He handed Lucas over to us and told us that he was special, that someone was looking for him, but that he would be safe here." Clara didn't ask any questions. She just accepted him. "It was my son," Elaine cried, tears burning in her eyes. "It was Daniel. How could they accept him without asking where he came from?" Elaine's voice rose just enough for Clara to appear in the doorway of the living room. Her face was pale and her eyes reflected a mixture of fear and fury. "Enough, Elaine," Clara said, her voice shaking. "You don't understand what happened. You don't understand what they did to us." "What they did to you?" Elaine repeated, incredulous. "I lost my son. He was taken from me, and you kept him as if he were a forgotten object." Clara advanced towards her with firm steps. For the first time, her coldness had broken, revealing a hidden desperation. "You don't know what we went through, Elaine," she said, tears in her eyes. "Lucas was given to us. We didn't steal him. We didn't know." "You didn't know?" Elaine replied, her voice full of bitterness. "Do you really expect me to believe you?" Arthur intervened, his voice almost a whisper. "The man who gave Lucas to us, he mentioned your name, Elaine. He said that the mother was looking for answers. Clara didn't want to tell you. She was afraid of losing him, afraid of losing Lucas." Elaine stepped back, feeling as if the world had split beneath her feet. The truth had struck her like a bolt of lightning. Luke was Daniel, his Daniel. He had been taken from him and had been handed over like an object to people desperate to fill his void. "You," he stammered, his voice breaking. "You knew who he was and you decided to keep quiet." Clara fell to her knees, hugging herself, while Arthur looked away, unable to bear his guilt. "We didn't want to hurt you, Elaine," Arthur murmured, "but Lucas is happy here. We take care of him. We love him like he's our own son." Elaine turned toward the stairs where Lucas was sleeping innocently. Her heart broke into 1,000 pieces. "He's not your son. He's my son." The silence grew so heavy that it seemed to fill every corner of the house. Elaine felt anger, sadness, and helplessness cloud her senses. But beneath it all, one certainty shone brightly. I had to decide what I would do next. Dawn came before Elaine could close her eyes. She sat by Lucas's crib watching him sleep. His small chest rose and fell calmly, as if the whole world was perfect for him. Elaine gently stroked his hair, feeling the weight of the decision she had to make. That night, Elaine packed her bags. The pain of leaving him behind was indescribable, but she knew that her love for him shouldn't be selfish. Lucas was happy, and that was all that mattered. As she walked away along the road that wound through the mountains, with tears in her eyes but her heart a little lighter, she knew she had made the right decision. She was free from the shadows of her past and ready to start anew. The sound of the bus's wheels on the pavement was almost hypnotic. Elaine leaned her forehead against the cold glass of the window, watching the mountain landscape fall away behind her. Dawn was spreading over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, like a silent promise that something better was to come. Every mile that took her away from that house weighed on her chest, but not as intensely as she had imagined. There was pain, yes, but also a glimmer of relief, as if she had finally let go of a burden she had been carrying around for too long. Lucas was sure, loved, and even though he was not in her arms, he was still hers in the deepest and truest sense. His phone vibrated in his coat pocket. He pulled it out quickly and saw a message from Arthur. "Lucas woke up asking for you. Clara and I told him that you will be back soon. Thank you for giving us this opportunity." Elaine let out a silent tear as she smiled sadly. She didn't answer. She still couldn't find the exact words to express what she felt. But she knew that deep down, her presence in Lucas's life would never disappear. The promise to be with him, even from a distance, was now the light that kept her going. Hours later, the bus dropped her off at the city station. The hustle and bustle of people, the honking of cars, and the bustling air seemed alien to her at first. I had spent too much time in that silent house, as if the real world had stopped in his absence. "Elaine?" A familiar voice brought her out of her reverie. Turning around, she found Laura, her friend, looking at her with a mixture of surprise and concern. Laura hugged her tightly without asking questions, giving her the space she so desperately needed. "I'm glad to see you back," Laura said softly as they both walked to the car. "You were starting to worry me." Elaine nodded, looking out at the horizon with a serene expression. "I'm glad to be back too." Over the next few days, Elaine began to piece her life back together. She went back to work, redecorated her apartment, and let the noise of the city wash over her. Each step was small but firm. She learned to live with Daniel's absence in a new way. She no longer felt like a shadow of herself. Now she was someone who had faced her worst fears and survived. One day, while sorting through her old box of memories, she found a photograph of Daniel. She held it in her hands, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was drowning in grief. "I promise I'll keep going, darling," he whispered, smiling softly. "And I'll always be there, even if it's from afar." Weeks turned into months. Elaine received regular updates from Arthur and Clara, little photos of Lucas playing, of his first tooth, of his wide, mischievous smile. Even though she couldn't touch him, seeing him growing up healthy and happy was enough to keep her strong. One spring morning, as he walked through the park, he saw a mother playing with her little son. Instead of sadness, he felt an unexpected warmth. The sun was shining brightly, strength, and for the first time, Elaine took a deep breath, feeling like the world belonged to her again. The past was behind her. Lucas, Daniel, they would always be in her heart. But the future now belonged to her. "It's a new beginning," she murmured to herself, while a soft breeze ruffled her hair and the city continued to pulse around her. With a firm step and her eyes raised, Elaine continued walking forward, letting life envelop her with all its possibilities. Sometimes life puts us in front of impossible decisions, where love and pain intertwine in ways we never imagined. Elaine had to choose between her own desire to recover what she lost and the well-being of an innocent who deserved to be happy. What would you have done in her place? Would you have fought for your son or let go of the past to give him a better future? Click on the video on the screen to continue this deep self-discovery day and reflect on the choices that define us. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on more stories that will make you think, feel, and grow. See you in the next video.